Okay. All right, it's 7 o'clock. I can see people starting to roll in. We've got 44 participants so far on Zoom. So I guess we will get started with tonight's webinar. Thanks everyone for attending. This is our last webinar for 2021. We've had some phenomenal speakers and great attendance. Tonight we have two more experts, leading experts in British Columbia who work both in BC and all over the world. So really thankful that they're both giving us their time and their gray matter. The purpose of these webinars really is to help educate people, let them ask their questions, and even more importantly, for those that attend, it's to help you have a conversation with people who may not be knowledgeable in these subjects. And so, you know, if we just pass this information off to a few hundred people who watch the webinar, it doesn't help us a ton. But if we pass this off to 2 or 3 people each or 4 people each, now we're talking about engaging hundreds, if not thousands of people in the province. So when you're meeting with your MLA or your MP, or even when you're talking with your coworkers, you can say, hey, I saw this great webinar and you know how wildfire works and all these solutions that the researchers presented. So that's the power in this. As always, I will say, if you feel like your blood pressure is rising and you're starting to get a little bent out of shape, keep in mind that both Bob and Dr. Daniels are not policy makers, they're scientists. And so when you frame up questions, please keep them to that effect. They're both really knowledgeable and they're both really knowledgeable about policies. So they may want to share their thoughts or their science behind changes in policy, but I'll just say that they are not the people that are causing these issues necessarily. They're the people that are trying to bring evidence to help change decisions. So with that, tonight, same format as usual. Dr. Down's going to go first, and then Bob will go second. It's going to be about 40 minutes, I'm assuming, around the presentation, followed by Q&A. If you have questions on Zoom, please put them in the Q&A function. I'll put them all together and then ask them at the end of the webinar. And on Facebook Live, same thing. Brian will be monitoring Facebook Live, and he'll send the questions my way. So without further ado, just some quick bios. Dr. Laurie Daniels, and I'm allowed to call you Dr. Daniels tonight, I assume. I always get in trouble for that. Okay, good. You earned it. So is a professor of forest ecology in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences, where she directs the Tree Ring Lab at UBC. Dr. Daniels investigates the impacts of natural and human disturbances and climate change on forests. With her research team, she has ongoing projects on wildfires, forest dynamics, and social ecological resilience to climate change across British Columbia. Her partnerships with local, provincial, and national governments, environmental organizations, forest management companies, community forests, and First Nations ensure her scientific advances are translated to active conservation, restoration, and management. And I will just put a plug that Dr. Daniels has also been one of our collaborators on the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project, where she's been working on the Elephant Hill Fire with Melanie and the group at Bonaparte Indian Band, who are also partners with the Southern Interior Mule Deer. So we're all kind of working together on this stuff. So that's Dr. Daniels' intro. Bob Gray Consulting specializes in research and application of many facets of wildland fire and ecological restoration. Fire research focuses on historic fire regimes and related ecosystem structure and composition at the stand and landscape level, the immediate and long-term effects of wildland fire, fuel treatment effectiveness, and the effect of past fires on fire spread and severity. Wildland fire operations include the application of prescribed burns to meet specific resource management objectives. So Bob kind of does everything that especially BCWF members are always keen to do. How do we do controlled burns? How do we do fuel management? How do we take care of habitat? And so Bob is the person. If you're on social media, they're both on Twitter, they're both very active. Bob has a list as long as Dr. Daniels in terms of the people who he's worked with, and it spans the continent. He works in the United States. He's worked with land management down there. He's involved in all kinds of projects, both sides of the border. He's worked with First Nations, different agencies and ministries. It's really long, and I could probably spend the first 20 minutes telling you about all the projects and all the great work they've done. But I'll leave that up to them. So again, thanks for attending tonight. Dr. Daniels, I guess you're up first. So if you could share your screen, that would be great. Perfect.
Fantastic. Everybody can see that and hear me? Wonderful. Well, Jesse, thank you so much. To the BC Wildlife Federation, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight. Bob and I have had the pleasure of working together for 15, almost 20 years now, tackling some of the questions. And I'm here to share with you some of what we've been finding from the historical fire reconstruction work that he and I and the graduate students in my research team have been conducting. And then we'll follow up with some of the directions, kind of scaling up to think about these big kind of landscape level issues that we are facing. We tried to be a little provocative here and looking forward and saying in 2050, will wildfire and wildlife coexist? And I think this is somewhat poignant given the type of experiences we've had over the last 6 months, which I will reflect on in a moment. But coexistence, trying to figure out how we as a society will coexist with fire is something that Bob and I have spent many hours talking about, and translating that also to think about how we might coexist with wildlife as well, wildfire, wildlife, and our human society, I think are really some of the big picture challenging questions we face. I want to share with you this clip from the Weather Network. Here we are on June 30th, 2021. We're mid-afternoon. We're looking here at the Sparks Lake fire. And I have to admit, as the end of June rolled around and as these news clips came across my screen, more smoke, more stand replacing fires, fast moving fires, in the extreme heat that we were experiencing at the end of June, my heart was sinking. Although I'm a strong advocate for fire on our landscapes, and I think that there is much to be said for having fire back on our landscapes to create resilient and healthy ecosystems, and to use fire to fight fire as an active management tool, fire under these types of circumstances in the ecosystems that we have seen burning in recent years are a serious concern to me. And let me share with you why. So there we were on June, the end of June, under that phenomenal heat dome, as we broke records and ended up with a record, a Canadian record for maximum temperature of almost 50 degrees Celsius in Lytton, British Columbia, a temperature that exceeds the maximum ever recorded in the Southwest and the deserts of the Southwest United States. And then 24 hours later, this horrendous fire that ignited and burned through the community of Lytton, and then continued to burn through much of the summer, burning tens of thousands of hectares. We know that climate change and extreme wildfire are linked and driving much of what we're seeing in these fires. And I wanted to share with you a few examples of the fire danger maps. I hope you've seen them or may be familiar with these fire danger maps, because here we're finding that forest fires and weather in BC are setting new records. So that record-breaking heat, the pronounced droughts that are coming with them, are creating conditions in our forests that make the forests at risk of fire. So here we have the danger rating maps, where we've taken the points, the different stations around the province, calculated from the fire weather what the danger rating is, from very low in blue, which is absent from these maps. The warmer the colors, the greater the fire danger. And I'm showing you here 3 different maps from 2017 on the left, 2018 in the middle, and 2021, the 3 record-breaking fire seasons in the past 5 years. And so let's start with the pop quiz. Can you compare and contrast these fire danger maps? What they have in similar, or what they have how they're similar, is that all 3 maps are showing high to extreme fire danger throughout the province, with only small pockets of moderate or low. A key difference between them, however, is that the first 2 maps on the left, you might notice, are for August, the peak of the fire season, in years when more than 1.2 million hectares burned. The far right is the map at the end of June, the 29th of June, the start of the fire season. And so already the province was primed for extreme wildfire. So let me be clear that this extreme temperatures, the extreme drought, and as a consequence, the fire danger and the fires that we are experiencing reflect these conditions that are being driven by climate change. Here we've summarized some of the key impacts of climate change on wildfire conditions. We're getting increased daytime temperatures, something we've all been experiencing, but also overnight lows are remaining above average. In fact, in the heat of the heat dome, at the peak of the heat dome in June and July of this year, nighttime temperatures that were supposed to be cool were actually exceeding the average daytime normals for that time of year. Because temperature and humidity are inversely related, those warm temperatures, both day and night, mean that relative humidity is staying low. That's prime burning conditions. We're seeing the length of the fire season expanding, starting earlier in the spring and then developing into longer droughts that are deeper and more pronounced by the end of the summer. And those are becoming more frequent as well. We're getting extreme weather events like the heat domes and wind events that are driving conditions conducive to rapid fire spread and very large and uncontrollable fires. And alongside those increases in temperature, we're also finding the type of turbulent weather that gives us increasing lightning strikes, which are sources of ignition. As a consequence of these combined influences, we're seeing the annual area burned is increasing and has been for the last 50 years in Canada. Concurrently, we're seeing that the severity of the fires, the intensity, the heat coming off of the fires, and the impacts on the environment and the ecosystems are increasing. Those consequences are, those magnify the consequences then to the environment, to our society, and to the economy. So here we are in 2021. The number of fires wasn't really exceeding our averages over the past 10 years, but we burned over 860,000 hectares, the third largest area burned in the province of British Columbia over the time that we've been recording wildfire presence. It was costly to try to suppress these fires. And I might add, we were finding, in fact, that the fires were exceeding our suppression capabilities. And the consequence to our society, with 56 days in a state of emergency, 67 fires burning and threatening communities simultaneously, and driving almost 500 evacuation alerts and orders this year. I want to focus in on the region in and around the Kamloops area. The Southern Cariboo, the Thompson-Okanagan region, where multiple fires were burning through the summer with tremendous impacts. And these fires in particular cause me great concern. These are our warmest and driest ecosystem types in the province. And these are the forests where I would least expect the type of high severity crown fires to be burning the way we saw them burn this summer. Let me tell you why I say that. Now, in my lab at the University of British Columbia, we used tree rings to try to understand how fires functioned in the past. And so I want to share with you some insights into historical fire regimes and forest dynamics, the types of changes that occur in forests that we have been able to reconstruct by analyzing centuries worth of tree rings. And we have kind of deep time history being preserved in these rings. If you've counted the rings on a stump of a tree, you would expect them to form kind of concentric circles as they move from the pith or the center of the tree out towards the bark. And I want to point out here that this particular tree, rather than forming concentric circles, has in fact these arcing lobes. Each one of these lobes embedded in this tree is marking the year in which a fire burned, and then the rings formed a scar over top of the damaged tissue. And so you can see here that this particular tree has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and I think there's one more 11 in this section of the photograph. 11 fires that burned and damaged, but did not kill this tree. I wanted to bring this tree in particular to attention. It was growing. It's a tree that we sampled down in southeast British Columbia on the Tobacco Plains, on the unceded traditional territory of the Ktunaxa First Nation. And we're down on the Tobacco Plains, Yakut Iqanuit Kliut, a region down near the border with the United States. This particular tree that I'm sharing with you is in fact the record ponderosa pine. It had 52 fire scars embedded in this single tree. It survived 52 fires over its lifespan between the early 1400s and the last year it formed a ring in 1894. This is one of more than 100 trees that Greg Green sampled as part of his PhD dissertation research. And I want to share with you his findings. The map on the left has Cranbrook kind of highlighted as a reference point, but each of these dots scattered throughout the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench are points that he sampled, collecting fire scars and collecting cores from trees to determine their tree ages. Here I want to show you the fire record he reconstructed. Each of these horizontal lines represents the time span or the timeline for an individual study plot. There's 20 horizontal lines representing each of his sites. The longer the line, the older the trees. So as we go back in time, his fire scar record goes back prior to 1400. Along each horizontal line depicted here, the vertical ticks are showing us when a fire was recorded as a fire scar embedded in the rings of one of the trees that he sampled. So you'll see here that individual sites experienced multiple fires through time. And the bar graph down at the bottom compiles how frequently those fires burned between 1400 and the present. At each of his sites, Greg was finding that the fires burned about once every 10 years. Every 10 years, there was a fire that scarred and embedded a fire scar in the tree rings. At every one of these sites, though, the fire scars stopped in the early 20th century. And it's been anywhere from 50 to 140 years since a fire scar was formed at those sites. A significant disruption to the fire regime. And we've associated that with the change in fire when Indigenous people were removed from their traditional territories and fire burning the land became illegal through the Bushfire Act in the late 1870s. We see landscape change as European settlers arrived, and then implementation of policies around fire exclusion and fire suppression. Now, in case this looks like it might just be a one-off example, I wanted to show you that over the last decade, in collaboration with multiple agencies, community forests, with BC Wildfire Service, with Parks Canada, with BC Parks, and multiple other agencies, we have replicated this type of study across 14 different locations in the province, all associated with dry forests, including the interior Douglas fir forest types, ponderosa pine, montane spruce, interior cedar hemlock, and even some low elevation sites in dry subzones of the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir forests. And the point I want to make here is that we have reconstructed over all of these sites long fire records with multiple fire scars and intervals not quite as short as those that Greg Green documented, but intervals of one fire burning on average every 20 to about 40 or 50 years, depending on the elevation and the forest type. So these historical surface fires that scarred and damaged but didn't kill trees were common and an essential part of our ecosystems historically. As we've disrupted that fire regime, we've made changes to the landscape, and this cartoon also comes from Greg Green's research. And so here I want to show you the mural that he has created that depicts how those changes have resulted, or how those changes to the fire regime have impacted our forests. So historically, those frequent fires would have allowed small seedlings to establish in the fire-free interval, but being small seedlings and small trees, in subsequent surface fires, those trees would have been killed and surface fuels would have been consumed, leaving low density forests and low volumes of fuel accumulated on the ground. And we see this dynamic kind of metastable system functioning for about an 800-year record when we look at the full record that Greg has reconstructed. We see changes with European colonization, though. By removing those surface fires, we began to allow new cohorts or age classes of trees to establish and then to persist. Some of those cohorts were also facilitated by high-grade logging and selective harvesting by early settlers who removed ponderosa pine and western larch. Sometimes fire was also introduced into these systems and then ultimately excluded through fire exclusion and suppression. We see a shift then towards a dominance of Douglas fir trees and an accumulation of seedlings, saplings, and understory trees through time, so that today's contemporary forests have much higher density of trees and have very, very different forest structures that make them much more susceptible due to the density of the trees and the accumulation of dead and slowly decaying material in these dry environments, an accumulation of biomass that's highly flammable. If we look at a bird's eye view in the aerial photograph and then a stand level view, we might imagine that historically the landscape looked more like this, with the light gray being grasses and woodlands and the darker gray being low density trees. This photograph from the middle of the early 1900s near Kimberley, where surface fires would have historically maintained these open forest conditions. But with fire exclusion, we end up with a fuels buildup and a shift towards ecosystems. Sorry, let me scroll these in. A shift towards closed canopy conditions. And here's one of those plots that Greg worked in. This is what it looks like in a forest that used to have just a couple of hundred trees that now has 7,000 trees per hectare. Finding the research team is like a game of Where's Waldo looking in that photograph. So the high density of trees, very small, slow growing, high fuel buildup, and frankly, low quality wildlife habitat is replacing many of these systems that used to burn at high frequency in the past. So linking this to the types of changes that we've seen with climate change and then recent fires, we see the exclusion of fire, the fuels buildup, linking with these extreme fire weather conditions driven by climate change. We're yielding fast, large, and intense fires. And here's a map that we've created using remotely sensed images before and after the 2017 wildfire on Elephant Hill that burned almost 200,000 hectares. Again, it's a heat map. The redder the tones, the more intense or higher impact the fire. And what I want to point out here is that this landscape would have been one where over much of that landscape, we would have expected surface fires in the past with some high severity fire. And yet we were finding high to moderate severity fire across elevation ranges and fuel types and forest types in 2017. Now, as Jesse mentioned at the beginning, the Elephant Hill has been one of the areas where we focused our work in recent years. And so we have put in a series of plots that we were monitoring to look at forest recovery across elevation and ecosystem types, as well as the severity of the burn. We found over the area that burned, 53% was moderate to high. Only 24% was low. 24% was moderate and 21% was low. And you can see that in the high areas, high severity areas, the amount of tree mortality and ground scorch was very high, as was fuel consumption, whereas we have kind of a gradient as we move towards the lower severity impacts. However, the majority of impacts were up here in the category where 80% of the trees or more were killed. We've been going back to these plots through time and monitoring what are the recovery of the plants, what trees are naturally regenerating, and then also collecting biomass samples that link together with the long-term monitoring taking place also to assess habitat for mule deer winter range and for mule deer, and the use of these habitats by the mule deer populations. I want to come back and set the stage for what Bob is going to talk about next as we scale up to the landscape level. So I want to return for just a few moments and highlight recent work by Jen Barron, another PhD student in my lab. This is a study that she has conducted by looking at the historical fires across the landscape in Southeast British Columbia. There we go. So here she's taken the historical fire records generated by the province and done an analysis, first to look at where fires burned in Southeast BC through the 20th century up to the present, looking at the change in the number of fires through time, the area burned through time, and also mean fire size. And she noticed significant changes in the 1940s, and then again after 2003, a shift in 2003 towards more lightning fires and a significantly greater area burned in recent years. Her work then, here it's shown mapped out where we see then changes in the fire return intervals. The early part of the 20th century, the landscape had a 55-year fire return interval. So those fires burning across coarse areas gave us an indication that told us that it would take 55 years to burn an area equivalent to your study area. The fire return intervals here shifted in the mid part of the century due to those multiple combined efforts of fire suppression and exclusion, removal of indigenous burning, and a period of cool, wet climate that reduced the amount of fire in the landscape and created a fire return interval of more than 700 years. And then a shift again after 2003, where we have a larger area burning over the last decade or two, and fire return intervals shortening again. When we look at the landscape, and here she's showing time since fire event on the left, and looking at areas that have burned or reburned over the last 100 years, we see a significant change or difference between the fire scar record and these landscapes. And what she has concluded is that over 80, almost 90% of our landscape is in a fire deficit, that it has not burned at a return interval that we would have expected. And so understanding the influence of these altered changes and beginning to understand what that means for future fire is the challenge that Bob is going to discuss with us next. And here I'm going to shift over, stop sharing my screen and pass the torch over to Bob.
Everybody see that okay?
Actually, Bob, we're seeing your presenter slides.
Yep.
Okay, how do we do that again?
I think there you go.
All right, stop share. So we get it?
No, it's still showing your your presenter view for some reason.
All right, let me swap. Okay, did that get it?
There we go. Off to the races. Awesome.
All right, bingo. All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lead in, Lori, and also thank to the Federation for the invitation to speak to your group. I sure appreciate it. I'm gonna launch right in here. So I'm going to build off of the climate discussion that Lori presented and talk about the fact that we need to act urgently and very aggressively and at the appropriate scale if we're ever going to mitigate this crisis. And so we talk about scale, we're actually talking about landscape level mitigation, mitigation of high severity fire. Some of the work that's been done at the Missoula Fire Lab by people like Mark Finney and Alan Agar, they've been looking at basically at what scale do we have to treat landscapes to start to have an impact on area burned and area burned at high severity. And so on an unconstrained landscape, what they found was that we need about 40% of the landscape in vegetation types and structures that exhibit either fire stopping characteristics, basically they're too damp or there's no fuels there, or low fire intensity characteristics, basically very, very shallow fuel beds, not a lot of fuel accumulation, in order to reduce annual area burned at high severity. So 40% of that landscape needs to be in vegetation structure that inhibits fire flow. On a constrained landscape, we need more than 50%. So the difference between an unconstrained and constrained landscape is when we start to layer on all of these various things like old growth management areas, timber tenures, things like that. Basically things that prevent us from doing aggressive management action. The more of those we have in a landscape, the more we have to treat the landscape to mitigate the impacts on those structures, basically. And we talk about those sort of conditions that we're looking for that can start to have an impact on fire severity. Closed canopy deciduous forests, large patches of closed canopy aspen, grasslands, shrublands, woodlands. Those vegetation types have basically shorter burn windows. They start to be mitigated overnight by rising humidity and lower temperatures, and they don't carry a lot of fuels. So typically grassland fires tend to have a single burning period. They burn through the grass. There's nothing to hold the fire overnight. They can have a big impact on limiting the size of fires that grow in a landscape. Healthy riparian systems. A lot of our riparian systems are nowhere near as healthy as they should be. We've done some work over in the Cranbrook area looking at fire histories, adjacent riparian areas, and historically they were stopping fires on the landscape. Today they're functioning as wicks. They're full of conifers, they're full of lots of dead and down fuels. Also recently burned, underburned, and reburned patches. So this is where recent fires have occurred, consumed all the fuels, and those patches on the landscape basically inhibit future fire in the landscape as well. They have a certain temporal scale to them, but they will function to inhibit fire flow. We're talking about actual management strategies and tactics to get us there: mechanical and manual thinning, prescribed and cultural burning, species and type conversions, and the use of modified suppression of wildfires. So that's where we need to get to, this sort of scale of the landscape. These are the kind of vegetation structures we're looking for, and there's a number of tactics that we can use to get there. So a couple of weeks ago, the province announced that they are moving to forest landscape planning. They're taking over this function from industry, and they're going to lead this function in the future. And they're looking at this specifically through the lens of fire, drought, and forest health. So in the past, higher level plans, fire management plans, they layered all these constraints on the landscape, all the various tenures and licenses and things. And then fire was an afterthought. It's sort of like, well, there's a patch over there in the landscape that currently isn't constrained, and we're going to let, if there's a fire occurs, we're going to let it do its thing over there. Well, the problem is fire doesn't recognize administrative boundaries. It's going to go where it can go, where basically there's fuels available to burn. So it's going to basically follow that pattern. So now the shift is to look at everything through the lens of fire, drought, and forest health. And that's the right thing to do. That's what we have to do. And minimizing the impacts from these three processes will take precedent. That's going to lead the charge. So basically, fire is driving the bus now. It's also going to require trade-off analysis so that critical resources are considered in plans to minimize natural disturbances. And those trade-offs can be anything from timber. So a good example would be there's been a recent fire in the timber harvesting land base. Under current rules, the licensee would go in there and replant it, restock it, control density, and get it back on its way to productivity. Well, you may want to basically not regrow that site now and maintain it as open grassland, and basically steer fires into that in the future. Use it as a catcher's mitt as part of a landscape level fire mitigation strategy. So everyone's going to have to probably compromise a bit on this. It's going to be a tough slog, but trade-off analysis is going to be a key part of it. To get us there, there are a number of tools and analytical methods that we can use to help us do that type of analysis and game out this future landscape and get us to where we need to be. And I've got a couple here that I'm going to introduce to you. And I'll also show you how there's the linkage to wildlife habitat with these models. So the first one is the tripod complex fires from East Central Washington that occurred 2006. It was actually two fires that started in July and grew together by August. Ended up being about 80,000 hectares in size. So our research team at Wenatchee Forest Sciences Lab, we have a landscape fire research team that I'm part of. This fire occurred and we were looking at what we could learn from this fire in particular. It was, starting to get these mega fires occurring more frequently in the landscape that Lori referred to. And this was a big one for East Central Washington. The first thing we looked at was if we hadn't put out a lot of those historic fires on the landscape, would tripod have gotten as big as it did? So the first thing we did was we overlaid all of the known fire locations on this map. All the fires have been suppressed. And down here in Winthrop is a smoke jumper base. And there's also an engine crew and a hotshot crew. So they had plenty of fire suppression resources there, and they jumped on all these fires. Well, they suppressed over 300 fires that eventually would have impacted the final perimeter of tripod. So right off the bat, we feel that there was a significant impact on how big tripod got by the fact that we were successful in suppressing so many fires. So our research question, and we called it the reburn model, and I'll get to what that is in a minute here. But so how do the location, size, and age of past wildfires influence subsequent wildfire behavior and effects? Were past wildfires effective as barriers to subsequent fire spread or to mitigate fire severity? I'm going to step out here and look at these things. So 70% of tripod burned at high severity. A smaller proportion burned at moderate, and a very small proportion burned at low severity to unburned. But the interesting thing was, there's all of these fires that basically occurred in the path of tripod. So here you've got the 1970 Forks fire, and tripod burned all the way around it. I've actually been on the ground there, and it sort of, eked in a few places as a surface fire, but it basically didn't burn through it. 1994 was the Thunder Mountain fire. Once again, tripod burned around it, didn't burn into it. 2003 Isabel fire, Farwell Canyon in 2003, and then the 30 Mile fire in 2001. So the interesting thing was, as this fire made its way north over the course of about 6 weeks, it kept running into and encountering these fires, and there just wasn't enough fuel continuity for those fires for tripod to spread into them. So they function as sort of hedges to fire flow in the landscape. They impeded fire movement. And we know that they do for a certain period of time. It depends on how hot that fire was and where it's located. Is it a burned area sort of linked in with topography or something like that? But they do function, to limit fire flow for a period of time. The other interesting thing is all of these green patches in here, like this large one down here, that's a 150-year-old lodgepole pine stand. But the fascinating thing was it had burnt about 170 years ago, And then it reburned 20 years after that. And the reburn consumed all the fuel. All the dead trees had come down and even some regen had grown in. It all burned up. And then a lodgepole pine forest grew up. Well, there was basically no surface fuel. So tripod slammed into that patch on a really good burnable day, high winds, high temperature, low humidity, and there just isn't enough fuel to carry a fire. So it just grew around it. Other of these green patches down here, there's green patches right in the middle of all this high severity. Those were 1970s and 1980s cut blocks where they did slash burning. And they all survived because once again, there's no surface fuel. So getting back to the reburn model in tripod is we want to look at this thing in the context of how do these sort of different structural stages and structural characteristics and fuels conditions affect fire flow? And finally, what are the implications for wildlife habitat? So STMs, state and transition models, are the key. They're the key that sort of drives the model. And they're used for vegetation succession modeling. And they help us sort of track forest structure and fuels over time. And the beauty is that we can apply fire behavior models to them and fire effects models to them. But in this context, we can crosswalk those state and transition components, the pathway components, to actual wildlife habitats. So while we're sort of structuring how fuels succeed over time, we can also, through a crosswalk to wildlife guilds, is we can track the proportions of wildlife habitat across the landscape over time. So for the tripod work that we did, we broke the landscape up into 4 forest types: dry mixed conifer forest, moist mixed conifer forest, cold, moist forest, high elevation subalpine, and basically dry, high elevation subalpine fine forest. So basically warm aspect and cool aspect forest. So with this model here, we start with bare ground. So we start the model with, there's been a standard replacement fire back here prior to the year 0. We've got all the trees are killed, or basically high severity means that greater than 80% of the canopy, overstory canopy, has been killed. Surface fuels have been consumed. And we assign a fuel model to this so we can actually run these things in a fire behavior model. So in this case, it's basically a fuel model that's bare ground. It's not going to burn. You can drop a match on a lightning strike. It won't burn because there's just no fuels. There's just fuel discontinuity. And it stays in that state for about 0 to 14 years. So, but over time, you start to get the influx of vegetation, herbs, grasses, shrubs, and eventually tree regeneration. So that's called stand initiation. You're initiating a new stand. In our model, we're also tracking the surface fuels. So between that first state, post-fire and stand initiation, a fair number of those snags have come down. It's building up surface fuels. So the next state, about 50 years time, the canopy is closed completely. When that happens, it shades out all surface light, and you don't have much of an herbaceous or shrub understory. It's mostly just needles and twigs and things like that. You also have a pretty high fuel buildup because now all of the antecedent stand has basically fallen and you've got a new forest growing through it. Once the canopy closes, you actually start to decompose those fuels over time. So there's a lag at that point when fuels have reached their lowest. Another 40 years, what we call understory reinitiation. So this is where you start to have small scale disturbance, insects, disease, snow press, wind throw, things like that. And the canopy starts to break up. You're starting to allow more light in through the canopy. And now you're going to get regeneration, herbs, grasses, shrubs growing, more fine fuels building up. And you're starting to see more fuel accumulation as that stand starts to break up. Another 40 years down the road, in this case, young forest multi-story, you now have sort of multiple canopy layers developing and also more surface fuels, because to develop those canopy layers, more overstory trees are dying. And a lot of these are shade tolerant species in the subalpine system. So finally, you'll reach this old forest multi-story, what we would call old growth. And in this case, it's at greater than 180 years. At that stage, we have a lot of layers in the canopy, lots of surface fuels occurring. So we take that and we do some plumbing with it. We create this diagram here of how the state and transition model works. So this is for the cold, moist conifer case. And this pathway up here is where we don't have any fire, or we have very low severity fire. So basically start here at state 1A, right after the fire. We've got a lot of dead trees. We're starting to accumulate surface fuels. And we basically, over time, we get to this 180 years and we have old forest multi-story. If we have a low severity fire somewhere through here, it doesn't change the direction of succession. It basically stays there. So we define low severity fire as causing less than 20% mortality in the overstory. So that's not enough to change succession direction in this case. What does change succession direction is if we have high severity fire either here or here. Those high severity fires tend to consume the regenerating stand as well as all the surface fuels. And that puts us on to what we call the reburn pathway. So this pathway here starts out right after that disturbance, and it grows through succession, both forest succession and fuel succession. But the important thing is for about the first 70 to 100 years, there's no surface fuel. And so these pathways and these sort of structural states are asbestos on the landscape. And they used to occur very, very frequently through fire suppression and fire exclusion. We sort of changed that pathway, but they were an important part of the landscape. So in our case, we're looking at developing state and transition models for lynx habitat. So what we can do is we can start here with this pathway state, and it describes mostly just surface fuels in the context of a fire behavior model. But we can link it to what's called the fuels characteristics classification system. This is a modeling system developed in Seattle. And what it does is it compares this fuel bed that we're talking about here in the stand structure state, and it inventories all the various component parts of that fuel bed, all the organic parts of that fuel bed. So ground fuels, duff, mosses, lichens, and litter, down logs, stumps, low vegetation stratum like grasses and sedges and forbs, shrub stratum, and then the canopy stratum, the actual live trees and snags and things like that. So for every one of these pathway states, we can create a FCCS fuel bed that basically inventories all of these things. And the good thing is, if we know enough about the structural components of wildlife habitat and guilds, we can then crosswalk to that. And so that helps us basically track, as we track this through our state and transition model, we're concurrently tracking wildlife habitat. So as these things go through succession, we can see how the landscape changes over time and supports different wildlife habitat. So what we use with the state and transition models is we use them to spool up the landscape. We're trying to create a model that can predict what that landscape functions, how it functions. And so what we do is we have some idea of the proportion of the landscape in different stand structure states historically. And to get that, we use a number of lines of evidence. We use fire history studies like what Lori defined and described. We also take the earliest historic aerial photographs, and we delineate stand structure states based on that. So we have an idea of what were the proportions of those landscapes in stand initiation, stem exclusion, young forest multi-story, et cetera. And we take our stand transition models and we combine them with fire weather and fire ignitions, and we plug them into a fire behavior model. And we keep sort of tweaking and tweaking and tweaking until we basically land on what that historic state was. And so this animation is basically showing us spooling up. And basically over time in each of these different forest types, you can see that the proportion of the landscape in each of these structure states shifts. It rises and falls and rises and falls. Taken over a 3,000-year spin-up simulation, and we get some very, very interesting patterns. So for our lower elevation montane forest, the majority of that historic landscape was in open forest, young open forest, we call stem exclusion open canopy, and old forest single story. So this is a corollary to old forest multi-story, which is more productive and moist ecosystems. Our driest ecosystems, which were open ponderosa pine, open western larch, open Douglas fir, we would refer to them as old forest single story. They didn't have these multi-layered stands. And so most of the landscape was in those two types. But there was also a little bit of young forest multi-story and old forest multi-story, these complex multi-layered forest types. They were there. They were always there in the landscape, but they didn't make up much of the proportion of the landscape. In our research, it was about 18%. They never kind of got beyond that, but they were always there, just sort of kept chugging along like this. The real shift that we see is, and the real difference we see is subalpine forests. Subalpine forests are far more complex, and they basically have a pattern of boom and bust. So they basically start to accumulate lots of young forest multi-story and old forest multi-story, and sometimes getting up to 40–60% of the landscape, and then boom, they reach a tipping point. And through all of these simulations of historic conditions, which we were basically able to line up exactly with what we got from those historic lines of evidence, our model is basically exactly mimicking historic conditions. We found that, you go through this constant cycle of accumulating more and more complex forests, multi-layers, lots of surface fuels, and you hit a tipping point, and then the whole thing goes, and you had large high severity fire. In the historic context, they weren't huge high severity fires, but they were larger on the landscape. This is a really good example of what's happened to our contemporary landscapes and what Lori was talking about, the fire deficit. So we have, through fire exclusion, fire suppression, and forest management, and sometimes our cherished constraints like protected areas and set-asides and things like that, we have stacked the landscape beyond the tipping point. And we have now gone into that area where we are seeing very, very large high severity fires on an annual basis. And until we can actually move back to this pattern, we're going to continue to see that boom and bust pattern. So getting to lynx. So Canada lynx was listed as an endangered species by the US Fish and Wildlife Service in the United States about 10 years ago. Back here in 1990 to 2000, there was a couple of fires out here, but lynx habitat was in pretty good shape. By 2015, 30 years later, 43% of the lynx habitat on the Okanagan Wenatchee has been severely impacted. And there's been fires since 2015. The Diamond Fire up here, which actually burned across the border, burned up most of this. Bit of mixed severity, but still a fair bit of high severity. So we're over 50% of lynx habitat's been severely damaged. And where it's been really hit hard, it's serious, but it's also starting to fragment it quite significantly. And it's creating sort of disjunct populations and separated populations. So there's a real problem with that. So one of the things we did in our tripod model was we looked at a couple of different wildland fire management scenarios. We wanted to see how those scenarios impacted lynx habitat. So the first scenario is complete absence of fire, no ignitions. Somehow we've reached nirvana with fire suppression and 100% suppression success. And then modern suppression, where basically we're successful at 98% of the fires, 2% get away. Partial suppression, which is once again, very successful during the summer, but we allow some spring and fall, ignitions to occur. And then finally a no suppression alternative. So this is the tripod landscape. Tripod is here in black, complete absence of fire. And you see what happens is that landscape just grows old. It's almost all multi-layered old forest, lots of canopy fuels, lots of surface fuels. And it's pretty good for lynx. There's this darker green color is denning habitat. This lighter green color is foraging habitat. You can see that there's actually a lot of good sort of interconnectedness between denning habitat and foraging habitat. But we know that that's not a realistic management option. So the second one was full suppression, but 2% of the fires get away. And that's certainly the case for tripod. It kind of reached beyond that tipping point and got away. So still have a bit of old forest scattered around. It's pixelated a bit, but still there. Some young forest multi-story for foraging habitat. And starting to see, it's still not too bad, but there's starting to be some larger areas where there just isn't any connectivity of habitat. Partial suppression, it's finer grained, some big fires up here. Once again, it's basically further degrading habitat for lynx. And then finally, the no suppression option, and a lot of the landscape has burned in very, very large fires. So this brown color is basically unburnable. It's bare ground. And this pink color is stand initiation. So mature forest is mostly gone. And we see that there's really not much habitat conditions for lynx. So this is just an example of what you can do with a model like this. And you can certainly intercede and do management actions to try to break up that landscape as opposed to sort of relying on natural fires and modified suppression, things like that. But it does show the potential of what you can do to have an impact on stand structure across the landscape and how that relates to wildlife habitat, especially in this case, lynx. Another example is, another option is to use modeling on the current landscape. We're not going to try to make that linkage to historic landscapes. And we're looking for predicted burn patterns and then, ways that we can mitigate that and have a mitigation effect on wildlife habitat. So this analytical method is, you convert the current forest cover to state and transition models and build crosswalks to wildlife guilds. You run contemporary burn probabilities using a model like Burn P3 or FLAMAT MTT. And burn probabilities basically, you run multiple simulations of where fire is going to flow on the landscape. What we're trying to get from that is a description of the problem fire. What's the fire? What are the fire parameters that cause the most negative impacts? The sort of the worst case scenario. So we want to know in the current context, what is that problem fire? It's probably a suite of fuel conditions and weather and topography. And of course, the only thing that we can control, is fuels. So we need to know that for the contemporary landscape. But as Lori pointed out in the early discussion about climate changes, we need to know how that's going to change over time. So we need to rerun that analysis using a range of future climatic conditions, the RCPs, 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5, because they're coming at us hot and heavy. And whatever we do today, we are trying to manage for conditions for several decades down the road. So the problem fire of today isn't going to be the same problem fire 20 years from now. The fires that occurred last fall in California, and certainly this summer's fires here in BC, I talked to some of my colleagues who were part of the last IPCC report and the modeling that they did. And those fires in Southern California last year were not predicted to occur until 2030, 2035. And they happened in 2020, which means that the fires of 2030, 2035 will be worse than the fires of 2020, and in our case, 2021. So we need to be looking at how that problem fire changes down the road. And then we need to game strategies to mitigate the impacts on key resources, through the spatial and temporal application of fuel treatments. And part of that is this trade-off with wildlife habitat as well. So the results of the analysis, we're looking at for fire spread pathways. We're looking for this big reveal using our model. It's okay, so if we do, 3,000 Monte Carlo runs so fire is going to go to some place very frequently, and it's going to avoid some places very frequently. So we need to find out what that is. We're looking for those most resilient locations for refugia and old forest. We need those components on the landscape. So we need to find out where do they historically hang out? And if we've got fire back on the landscape, where do we have the greatest success of meeting those objectives? We have to think about fire as a contagion. It's going to go wherever there's, vulnerable or susceptible conditions for its movement. And the best way that we can interrupt a contagion like fire is the same way interrupt a contagion like COVID. We inoculate the landscape. We shoot for herd immunity. So we have to do enough treatment on that landscape in the right locations that we can actually start to interrupt this contagion. So we're looking for the most effective treatments and locations. Where are the biggest gains in investments? In some places, it doesn't make sense to do any treatment. It has no effect. Other places give you huge dividends, has a big impact on fire flow. What we need to also use are STMs, and they help us to reveal the temporal effectiveness of these treatments. How soon do fuels reaccumulate and need to be treated? We use that pathway and those time series between the different states of that thing to say, okay, right now we're in this, non-burnable type, but we know that in 10 years time, we're going to regrow enough fuel that this can carry a fire. So that starts to put you on a maintenance schedule. You can use either management ignited prescribed fire, or maybe there's a wildfire that occurs in that area and you take advantage of it. But you need to have a long-term strategy of knowing where to treat, how often to treat, and when it becomes critical to retreat. And we can assess the spatial and temporal patterns of wildlife habitat. So how long does it persist on certain parts of the landscape? How much is typically there at any one time? The spatial distribution. Where are there conflicts with other resources? So, you've got mountain caribou occurring in this polygon, but that polygon, when you finish doing your burn probabilities, you find out that that polygon wants to burn every single time. So it's just a matter of time. That, you're not going to be able to save that polygon. So it puts you into this situation where you're going to have to do a trade-off analysis and be realistic about what is possible, what's a gain and what's a loss in these things. And that you require the best information available to help you make those decisions, because they carry a lot of consequence. So finally, in summary, moving forward with these forest landscape plans, and so far there's not a lot of information out on what's going to be involved in them. It's basically it's in progress right now. But we need an understanding of fuel bed characteristics and their linkage to wildlife habitat guilds. That's just so critical. We need to have a really good inventory of both of those. Fuel succession over time, i.e. how will fuels change with climate change and synergistic disturbances? Where and when are the critical thresholds for fire behavior and fire effects? We need to know that. And we need to have an ability to model fuel characteristics, fire effects, and linked wildlife habitat guilds over space and time on broad landscapes. That's the best way to help us get to where we need to get to. I strongly encourage the Federation members to, immerse yourself, inject yourselves into the process, and advocate for a robust and integrated approach to forest landscape planning as it affects potential wildlife habitat, both terrestrial and aquatic. And I thank you for your time. If you need any further information or you're requesting anything, please don't hesitate to contact myself or Lori. That's what we do. We are there as a resource. There's not a lot of us fire ecologists around, but it's attendant upon us to help out where we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Daniels. And Bob, will shift over to questions now. And I haven't had the flood yet, so I will ask one, because Bob took the time to meet with the Fish, Wildlife and Habitat Coalition not too long ago and bring us up to speed. We have a whole bunch of landscape that's been burned, and there's a big interest in salvage logging now. For people that care about habitat and wildlife and fish, do you have any recommendations or places we should be focusing in on?
I think, looking at this type of landscape analysis is finding out, once again, as quick as you can, is, where does fire want to go? Where does it not make sense to try to put something that you don't want to get burned up? And start to break up our landscape into places where we can herd fire where we need to. So careful removal of biomass is important, because we don't want a lot of reburn everywhere. And as I told your group, it should not be economically driven. Certainly if you can, pay for these things through the removal of small diameter wood, that's great. But you also need to leave structure out there. So if it requires some kind of a subsidy to remove the biomass, that's what you do. But not rush into massive economic salvage and replanting. You're throwing bad money after bad money, and it's going to reburn again. Lori?
Yeah, well, and I want to kind of follow from what Bob just said is I think we seem to be making the same mistake over and over again. We're in this rush to go and salvage wherever we can for economic gain, not paying attention to the impacts of that salvage. It's a compounding disturbance on top of other disturbances already there. Much of these areas that are burning have already been subject to insect or other disturbances in the past decades or so. And then we're implementing stand level strategies for replanting and choosing densities and species compositions that we're supposed to optimize economic gain. But we know now that that's contributing to the wildfire problem. And we know now as well that many of those strategies create very low diversity of forest composition and structure, wildlife habitat, and create vulnerabilities in our landscape. So we really need to rethink at the big picture landscape levels what we are doing and how we respond to those disturbances.
I just add one more thing, Jesse. And the thing is, if you look at some of the satellite imagery, and if you overlaid the perimeter of some of this year's fires, White Rock Lake, certainly Sprouts Lake, all the ones in the Bonaparte, they burned a lot of young plantations. These are less than 20-year-old, and there is no salvage opportunity there. The best thing you can do in those is basically where you can tie into a logical burn unit boundary, and then in a couple of years' time, reburn them through prescribed fire, and then work with woodlands, grasslands, shrublands. These ecosystems, as Lori pointed out, these are our driest ecosystems, and they're only going to get drier. So the idea that you're going to grow a closed, canopied, productive forest on these sites it's a non-starter. So where we've toasted these young plantations of 3-meter tall trees, wait until they fall down again, mixed with the incoming herbaceous fuel load, and then strategically burn them and keep them in early seral.
Got it. The questions are pouring in here.
Awesome.
Maybe I'll just stick on salvage right for now. 2 questions. The first one, is it better to leave burned trees or should they be removed?
The burn tree component is, we don't want to get into a case where we've had, very, very high density of larger material that falls to the forest floor and accumulates and then burns in a reburn, especially on shallow soils. We can look across the West where we've had this happen, and you're basically volatilizing all of the nutrients in the soil when that burns again, because you've got a smoldering fuel bed of large fuels that have a long burnout time, and there's a significant heat flux into the soil. A lot of that heat doesn't go this way, it goes this way. And so, these are shallow soils, they're nutrient poor. Things like nitrogen are easily cooked off at 175 degrees. These fires can easily exceed a couple hundred degrees Celsius and last for a long time. All you have to do is exceed 60 degrees Celsius to kill cell tissue, whether that's soil invertebrates or seeds or plant propagules. So where we have low density stands of lots of dead material, we can probably get away with just letting that stuff come down and burn it as it happens. But really, really dense stands of lots of material, we got to think about that one. There are real environmental consequences of letting that accumulate and burn again.
That's where some of that landscape strategy and thinking about resilience, where are the places where we know we have large areas that have those big fuel loads that will eventually fall to the ground and be fodder for the next big fire? Can we break those up in the landscape? And can we think differently about what to regenerate on those sites? Those are also places, I would say, Bob, help me out here if you agree or disagree, where we need to be thinking about allowing that diversity of species back on the landscape, including aspen and birch and some of our other broadleaf trees. We have significantly altered the proportion of mixed and broadleaf forests on our landscape in favor of conifer forests through our timber management on the timber harvesting land base, which extends over such a large area of our productive forests in British Columbia. And there's a consequence for that, and the consequence is reduced resilience. So we need to rethink that strategy.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Lori. And, you and I have both spent a lot of time in Southeast BC, and I think the most endangered ecosystem there is aspen. I mean, it's been completely eradicated from the landscape, and there should have been a lot of it on that landscape. So yeah, 100% agree, letting it come back into higher diversity. The other thing is in those cases where we do have this potential for significant buildup of surface fuels and a very hot reburn, is we prescribe burn it as that dead stand starts to come apart. We have to take a more proactive role in basically converting those standing fuels into emitted CO2 and CO. You talk about the fire deficit. Well, what happened with that fire deficit is we got a massive accumulation of biomass on sites that just historically never carried it. So we have a responsibility to remove that biomass from the site, and we have a couple options for it. And one of them is just periodic prescribed fire. So
great. Last one on salvage. Are you able to explain how salvage increases the threat of catastrophic fire or the subsequent issues around, basically nuking soil?
As salvage has been applied, it's even the term salvage is an economic term. And so what typically happens with salvage is it's a low financial probability anyway. So you have burnt wood. It's difficult on saws because it tends to dull saw blades. So it's expensive. So you've taken a very low value product, and now you need to be as economical as possible with it. So you build more roads, you build larger landings, and you try to capture the largest volume pieces as you can. You need to basically manage as few pieces as possible and look at as much volume as you can for little effort. So you tend to high grade. Salvage tends to be in a high grade operation. So you leave branches and tops in the woods, and you leave all the undersized stuff that is not economical. So all you've done is you've shifted standing dead to surface dead, and you've built up the surface fuel layer. So, and then it mixes with, incoming herbaceous. So you tend to have not only high intensity, but also high spread rates. So you've exacerbated the problem.
And we've seen that with the mountain pine beetle affected fuels. We relaxed those rules for a short period. They were salvaging dead pine trees. Permission was allowed for companies or for that salvage operation to leave the dead treetops and the like on site with a higher proportion or a higher biomass left behind those sites, thinking they would decompose. And what we're finding is they're not decomposing as fast as people thought. So we ended up in many areas where there was a lot of debris, biomass left on the ground. It didn't decompose rapidly. We've had this decade now, 15 years of hot, dry conditions with really extreme fires. And we used to think of cut blocks. Bob described some where we used to do cut blocks and prescribe burns to reduce the surface fuel loads. They are fuel breaks and fire breaks on the landscape. Where we left all that debris behind after salvage logging, it's like, taking a campfire and turning it into a bonfire. Then when fire spreads, instead of stopping the fire where those cut blocks are, they're acting as wicks. They're transmitting fire through that block. It's killing all the regenerating trees, whether they are broadleaf or needleleaf. We're finding that they're getting cooked. We're consuming all of that biomass on the ground, producing a lot of smoke, creating a lot of heat into the soil, damaging the soil, making it more challenging to regenerate a healthy forest afterwards. So this again it's a very challenging situation that we face. And again, we need to be strategic, not focus just on the maximum economic gain as fast as we can, getting dead trees from fire or from burnt areas, but strategically, let's look forward to think where fire is going to transmit on that landscape and use salvage as a way to take advantage of this silver lining opportunity that we've been given and reconfigure these landscapes to be more resilient for the next generation.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe we'll get into the broadcast burning a couple ox was common pre-2000. How do we get back to it for fire mitigation? And of course, for us wildlife people, there's a whole bunch of benefits in terms of plant community response too. So any insight around the adversity and how we can work around that or make it happen?
That's a good question. There, it's not as hard as the province makes it seem to get prescribed fire back on the landscape. We do have a deficit in people who can mentor new people into the practice. A lot of people who did carry a lot of prescribed burning in the past are no longer doing it now. But the training programs are available. There's enough people that can be involved in the training. There's enough people who can be involved in mentoring. You need a very steady supply of funding for it. You need to streamline the approval process. You need to be having mentors basically peer reviewing burn prescriptions. You need to build up the capacity of not only burn bosses, but also people involved in helping you carry out the burn, ignition specialists and holding specialists and things like that. It's not impossible. If you set a target in BC of, let's say by 2025, you want to be burning 50,000 hectares a year, you could meet that target. But it means you're going to have to suck it up and do what you need to do, provide the funding, here is the standard for training, go out and get it wherever you can. BC's not going to deliver it. If you need to, import some folks from the States who can help mentor it, do that because they're available, they can do it. The US burns 10 million acres a year in prescribed fire. The state of New Jersey burns more than BC does in an annual year. It's embarrassing. Anyway, it's not impossible. We can get there.
Dr. Daniels, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would add too. I think this is a little bit of an education piece as well. I think in terms of kind of the technical and the practicalities, we know there's a pathway forward. I think maybe there's some hope with this landscape level planning that we're beginning to diversify our thinking in British Columbia, thinking strategically rather than always at the stand level focus on kind of timber production, which we're very good at, but we know now there was severe unintended consequences of that. So how do we undo that? How do we kind of reverse engineer that problem and move forward? I do think in my experience, we still run into problems with resistance from some other academic communities. We've seen resistance in terms of smoke impacts on human health, for example. I have colleagues from the School of Public Health that we've worked closely with to kind of rethink those problems. How do we, and I think we've learned the hard way in BC, how do you want your smoke? We've eaten smoke for the last decade, summer in the heat of the summer with huge health consequences for millions of people. And we can't afford to do that any longer. So we have learned that a small amount of smoke under controlled conditions is probably acceptable after all, if it means that we can reduce those bigger health impacts. And that was a hurdle to get over. And it's been really fascinating and I think really rewarding collaborating with people, with colleagues from the School of Public Health and other agencies who started out our conversations saying there is no good smoke, this is unacceptable, to, what? We need to find a path forward that allows some smoke where we can give people the heads up, take those warnings, etc. So I think, I've seen real inroads there in a place that, that's a trade-off. One of those trade-offs is a little bit different from the one Bob was talking about earlier, but an important one for us to consider. And then also for the public, we need kind of, the public to understand, public education and engagement with the roles of fire beyond the traumatic impacts that fire is having on our society in the summer. We see and experience a lot of fire that does have very detrimental impacts, ecological, societal health, human health, mental health. Telling those same people now we're going to have prescribed fire in their neighborhoods can be equally traumatic unless we really lay the groundwork to get communities prepared for that.
Yeah, and I would just add that one of the we have to really tackle smoke management planning appropriately, as Lori said. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure that we incentivize the highest utilization possible of biomass on whatever the prescribed burn unit is. We need to be doing a lot of burning of cut blocks, and that means that we have to have very high utilization so that what we are burning is fine fuels. Fine fuels are what generate the most embers. They're the biggest problem from a fire spread and spotting perspective. So if we have very high utilization, we have very few emissions. We have very short burn times. We don't have a lot of lag and smoldering combustion going on. And we have safer burns. It just gives us a larger window to burn into. So we have to marry high utilization with prescribed fire. And the fascinating thing is, if you look at the prescribed fire history, especially on the west side of the Cascades, where there was a lot of prescribed burning going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s, is in the States, it was preceded by what was called yum yarding, which is where they yarded up all that excess material that they couldn't do something with, put on the landing and burnt the landing. And then when they burnt the block, it was just burning fine fuels. So, they knew what they needed to do then, and they were under the constraint of burning close to very large urban centers on the west side of the Cascades. So we have to do the same thing now, where we're not using prescribed fire to consume massive amounts of surface fuel. We can't do that. As Lori pointed out, the environmental consequences and the social consequences are significant, and we would get shut down before long anyway. So we have to have high utilization of biomass so that we're burning finer materials. It just makes it easier, more cost effective, and ecologically more sound. So, and definitely do the social science side. I do a lot of burning in southeastern BC around Cranbrook and Kimberley, and we've done extensive work with the public and with the elected officials. And we missed our burn window last spring, and we are burning right next to houses in the interface. And the response we got was, well, you're gonna get this burn off, aren't you? By next fall. And so it's we'll get there. We're going to get a window one of these years, but we are now under the gun to get the burns done versus being under the gun to stop the burning. So that's where we need to be.
May I add one more component? And I know Bob has been really involved with this as well, that there's a real movement, and it's a legitimate one, and one that I think is part of our commitments to UNDRIP and reconciliation in our province. But Indigenous communities, we know, we have a much better understanding. Western science is finally catching up with the oral histories that have been shared with us that we refused to listen to for a century or more.
And acknowledge
that Indigenous fire stewardship was a huge part of this landscape that we now call, British Columbia. And there are Indigenous communities all over this province who have, in many cases, still continue to practice fire stewardship on reserve, but would like to transmit that practice onto their traditional territories over broader areas. There are places where those practices are still in, ongoing practices, and places where there is strong desire to revitalize and to get that moving. And that is, I think, one of the part of the paradigm shift, the transformative change on our landscapes that need to happen. I think we're taking, small steps in the right direction. But I think that is part of this solution. And as Bob just described, if the fuel loads are in the right conditions and we are burning in the right seasons, the spring and the fall, under low fuel load conditions, we're being consistent with what we have been told. We're historical, traditional, Indigenous, cultural fire on the landscape, and it has strong ecological benefits, both for plants and for wildlife habitat. And so I really think the more we get outside of our colonial box and begin to think in these transformative ways on the landscape, we might find ourselves going down new, old paths and finding tremendous benefits with them.
That sounds good. And that ties into, I think you kind of answered the question, but one of the questions was, why not just default to decentralized cultural burning? And I think you may have just touched on that.
Yeah, I think we that's going to be really appropriate on many parts of the landscape. I think we're a little bit challenged though, because again, Because so much of our forest landscape has been highly altered by multiple disturbances and exclusion of fire for a century, we have a little bit of homework to do before we can get back to those cultural burns and those historical traditional practices without introducing damage to the landscape. So that's going to have to be a collaborative effort with Indigenous knowledge, supplemented with some of our Western learnings and what we know about fire behavior, and move forward. I know, Bob, you've already been working on this with ACAM, with the Tanaha, and the St. Mary's Band and others in Southeast BC as well as other areas. And these are really the places where we have huge strides and opportunities in our society to meet multiple goals as we move forward.
Yeah, I've also worked with a number of tribes in the US. I've worked with the Apaches in Arizona and Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs in Oregon. And they have a really good marriage of Western science and cultural fire knowledge. Cultural fire knowledge drives the fire objectives. This is why we're burning. This is when we're burning. This is how we're burning. And then you marry that with, you know, the skills development stuff that we have through our fire modules. You know, this is how we safely conduct prescribed fire and you know, holding operations, ignition operations, and things like that. So it really functions well as a really good marriage. And places like that have really successful programs. I mean, San Carlos now, they burn, you know, anywhere from 25 to 60,000 acres a year, and where they've had wildland fire now, they can manage them as wildland fire use, and they're not damaging because they've done so much burning that there's just no fuel. So it's really worked out well. It's because of this marriage of the cultural side, which drives the objectives, which are fire effects driven, and then the Western side, which is here's the skills that we need to do this, you know, with safety and communications and all those various components built in. So definitely getting there. And in the Southeast, we've launched ahead with doing our own burn boss training. We've adopted the NWCG program from the US, and we're building the capacity of burn bosses for both ACAM, Tobacco Plains, Tunaha, part of the Tunaha Nation, as well as municipal fire departments. So we need the capacity. We have 9 burns lined up for next spring, and we have a backlog now. So, you know, one of our biggest problems is just burn bosses. So we identified it a couple of years ago. We're taking the lead on it, and we'll just continue to do that. And, you know, maybe we become one of those Trex locations where we entertain you know, transfers of knowledge with people. So
we've seen other examples in British Columbia too. The Silkatine, the Secwepemc are all working towards models that they can that can be implemented on the landscape. And I really feel as though there has been kind of a shift. From my perspective, there's been a shift since the 2017 fires to, I think, more openly listen the Abbott-Chapman report with Chief Maureen Chapman, and the many recommendations about acknowledging and including and focusing on Indigenous knowledge and cultural fire, I think really came across strong and clear and are reshaping how we think about fire in our province to the benefit of all of us.
definitely.
Great. I have a big stack of questions coming. I think you've convinced people that we need more fire. A lot of these are policy related. So one is, and I'm sure you're ahead of the curve, should we be developing new fire behavior models due to climate change? If so, would that change the decisions we make in suppression strategies and landscape level planning?
Yeah, I'll jump on this one first, Laura, then you can add in. When we apply prescribed fire, we need to be at the level where we're sophisticated in our understanding of how fire is impacting various components of the fuel bed. So we need our fire behavior models and our fuel bed models to reflect a better understanding of how complex and variable those fuel beds are. So as we're applying prescribed fire, especially because it's all about meeting fire effects objectives, then we need to marry those critical fuel bed characteristics of fuel moisture, fuel particle size, fuel loading, fuel continuity, chemical content, all those things, so that we can tailor our application of prescribed fire to meet our objectives in a much better way than we currently have. We're applying prescribed fire now with the tools in BC as we would a cleaver for basically brain surgery. It doesn't work very well. Most patients die. But you can apply a scalpel to this. I've burnt 14-year-old conifer plantations, underburn them and consume the fuels and kept most of those trees alive. It's possible to do that if you have an understanding of fuel bed conditions. And right now we have very blunt instruments, and those instruments were not built for prescribed fire. You have to understand that. So the Canadian Fire Danger Rating System is a fire danger rating system. It was built to give you a regional perspective on how dry fuels are and what kind of fire behavior you can predict. Its application in boreal situations is okay, but when we start talking about montane BC, which has more in common north-south with the Western US than the rest of Canada, you need systems where you're under inventorying and understanding the fuel bed components. And that also enables us to track things like carbon, which we need to do. We can track impacts on wildlife habitat because we're targeting fire on certain components of the fuel bed. So we need to basically move to adopt a lot of those US systems. They're paid for. They have a much larger budget and research institution and network that develops this stuff all the time. We're not investing in it in Canada, and we're not going to invest in it. So don't leave us in this deficit situation just for parochial reasons. I think I've got myself in enough trouble with that.
Dr. Daniels?
Yeah, well, I think again, as Bob said, we need to diversify our thinking. We know that there are excellent models that were developed, that were calibrated, that have been verified in ecosystems that are much like our dry forests in BC. Bob gave us some excellent examples from the tripod complex, which is immediately south of the Okanagan. I mean, those fires burned into Cathedral Provincial Park and into the southern Okanagan. There is no reason for us not to translate those models north. And in fact, Bob and I are working on a team where we are doing exactly that, is working with the US models, the reburn model that Bob talked about, transporting it north of the border into comparable ecosystems, and then beginning to calibrate it to help us to ask and answer these types of questions here in British Columbia. And I know, as a scientist and a university professor who funds students who do these kinds of research, I'll put in the plug as well that we need to also be doing the before and after measurements. We need to monitor and know that we met our objectives and to keep track so that when we make mistakes, we know why and how we made that mistake and we don't make that same mistake. And again, we got to where we are today as a result of unintended consequences for things we thought we were doing right. We thought suppressing fire was good and saving the forest. It generated fuel conditions that are leading to more specific or more extreme fires. We've made choices about forest management at stand levels that yielded landscape level vulnerabilities. If we aren't measuring what we are doing, the impacts of our attempts to mitigate and to restore, and monitoring to see if in fact we've been successful, not just at the time, but over the subsequent years, and seeing the outcomes of those interventions, we're going to make the same mistakes as the generation before us. And I think we know better than to do that. And so that's a big part of the investments that we are making, for example, with those long-term permanent plots at Elephant Hill, and by collaborating with organizations and agencies to do that monitoring, to do that measuring, and to collaborate to make sure those data sets are being used in the most effective ways.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to combine a bunch of questions into one. And I think I know where a lot of this is coming from. We have this world of caribou, we have this world of fire frequency changing. We have this world where, in our case, we're trying to get burns done and we cannot seem to get them done to save our lives despite having science on our side. Can you help understand how the lessons apply in different parts of the province in terms of disturbance regimes and how well do we understand fire in these different regimes and how it's changing. And so maybe we can even use the Northeast as an example, where there's a lot of interest to get some ecosystem restoration going and prescribe fire back on the landscape. And there's it's meeting a lot of resistance. And so, we talk about NET4 and fire frequency a lot, but what about in those places where climate change is catching up to us and we're putting out fires? Do you have any insight into that kind of question?
Oh.
Yeah, what a challenge. So I'm gonna tackle the NDT question first of all, and I want to point out that the NDT system was state of the art in the 1990s when we developed it. That was 30 years ago. We've have 30 years worth of science that has really given us a much more nuanced understanding of fire regimes. And I'm a little frustrated that we're still entrenched in the NDT system. And it really, with the exception of NDT4 that allows that there's some surface fire mixed with some infrequent high severity fire, the rest of the NDT system is focused on stand replacing fires and assuming 80 to 100% mortality across the entire province, except in the valley bottoms of the dry systems. And so I'll just say once and for all, disturbance doesn't work like that. Never worked like that. It shouldn't work like that today. And until we let go of that and build in the nuances of what we now understand about multiple disturbance agents and their interactions and their synergisms, we're going to say it, we're going to keep falling into the same pitfalls. I hear the frustration. I don't think the frustration that's being expressed kind of about the Northeast, that there's multiple prescriptions. Bob, you know this better than I. I don't write the prescriptions and I'm not waiting pins and needles, for the conditions to be right for those prescriptions to be able to move forward. But my understanding is across this province, across multiple ecosystem types, there are prescriptions waiting to be implemented for prescribed burns, to meet many, many different objectives. And we just seem to have a really significant barrier preventing that from moving forward. And so this is a common concern being expressed by people from a whole range of disciplines that also are concerned about the use of fire.
Yeah, and I think with this one is partially, there's a lot of backcasting that goes on. This is, in this area, it should only be every 200 years when we have a fire. And of course, we know that that's generally not true. But in addition to that, are we looking forward to say, okay, in this ecosystem, the interval was 100 years, but now because things are warmer and drier, it's 50 years. So start thinking about that now, as opposed to waiting for another 50 years before you light the fire. Maybe that's the question.
Well, and I think you've just framed exactly the question we need to be thinking about really broadly. I think we got a little bit stuck in British Columbia too. I can think of it, workshops that I was at, 5 and 6 years ago, 2014, 2015, at a meeting, where we were concerned about only about the very driest subzones of the interior Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone and how climate change was going to affect that subset of that subzone in the driest part of the province. And I remember saying at that point, the scope of the problem is well beyond that. So what you've just pointed out, Jesse, is what others are noticing around the province is disturbance regimes are changing everywhere. We saw that with mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle was eruptive. It's expanded its range. It's extended its range across the Rocky Mountains. That's a climate change impact. Fire is hot on its heels. Bob, I'm sure you have some good insights that you can add as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lori. I think, and Lori brought the point too, that the ecology needs to catch up with the cultural understanding of these landscapes. I've certainly looked at the various the Beck classifications in the Northeast, and but you need to marry that with the cultural history and the indigenous populations that have occurred on those landscapes for centuries, millennia. Actually, Hank Lewis did a great paper called about Aboriginal fire in northern Alberta. Came out probably 20, 30 years ago. But from a simple level of perspective of survival, you couldn't survive on a landscape of closed canopied conifer if you're an indigenous group. There's nothing to eat. And you'd be running from most of your life from wildfires all the time. So those landscapes were pockmarked. They were highly, pixelated by fires. And those fires were there to, basically create and maintain early sterile conditions that provided foods and trapping opportunities and also survival from passing fires. So, however, some idea of forest structure was developed by regional ecologists, it doesn't match the anthropological and cultural history of those areas. So, people have lived on those landscapes for a long time. You could not live on a landscape of closed conifer where you had, basically really good burning conditions every year. So it was either wildfire taking you out or something. So our understanding of those landscapes needs to basically be updated. And there is every justification for doing a lot more prescribed burning in those cases. Climate change is certainly one of them, but just a better understanding of the cultural condition of those landscapes.
Got it. Now here's another, these are a lot of policy questions. How will this science feed into forest management policy in BC? Are the FLPs the main or only route?
We don't know enough about how the FLPs will be developed. The one conversation I had with a colleague of mine who works for the ministry was that they're not even sure if this is going to be on the scale of a timber supply area or a licensee area. That's all still being worked out. There's a lot of issues around when you basically state that you're looking at everything through the lens of fire. Right off the bat, you're talking massive compromise for a lot of things. You can't have a provincial AAC the way it is and also look at the landscape through the lens of trying to mitigate high severity fire. So I see this taking a while to sort, and if it becomes a disjointed effort where if there's silos creating plans all over the place and they're not linked in the whole bit, that'll be a disaster too. So stay tuned.
So we know what the problem is. We need to work on the solution, I guess, is what you're saying. We all know that what we've been doing doesn't work.
And we're not quite sure how to undo it. Right. We know where we need to get to. Hopefully, I hope we understand where we need to get to. And we're over here, and getting from here to here, we want to do it with as little pain as possible. And that's probably the first mistake, because it's going to be very painful. But we all know that if you take the pain up front, it gets less painful over time. So you're better off biting the bullet now and doing it. But, politically, we tend to kick the can down the road.
Right.
Not those difficult decisions. So
I think we struggle a little bit, and maybe I'll point out, maybe it feeds back to that question about, what should we do in the Northeast or in any given landscape? And, the answer to that, you could probably put 10 scientists in the room and get 10 different answers depending on their expertise. And so trying to think about those holistically and those connections. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about, so maybe I'll just put a little thought exercise out there and see how people might respond. Jesse, let me know if the chat goes ballistic on this one, but I thought a lot about these landscapes and thought, I don't think these landscapes, from everything I have done for the last 20 years on fire history and forest dynamics reconstructions, with the exception of the coastal forests. So as soon as I moved to the interior, where they were very dynamic systems that were changing through surface fire and intermittent, moderate and high severity fires, interacting with a whole guild of insects and other disturbance agents, these were very, very dynamic systems. But also, I don't think the landscapes that we see today were the landscapes that were here historically, pre-European colonization. Those 14 sites that I mapped out and said they used to have lots of surface fire, in every one of those study areas where we have aged the trees and looked at the distribution of the ages of the trees relative to when fires burned and didn't burn, we find that 70% or more of the trees in our beautiful green British Columbia established after the last surface fire burned in those forests, and they persist today because there is no surface fire. So my undergraduate degree is in zoology, and I remember learning about a strategy. It was actually a reproductive strategy, the best of a bad situation for male birds that couldn't find good mates. They would just take whatever they could get. I'm going to scale that up to wildlife. What if today's wildlife are in places in our landscape that is not optimal habitat, but it's the best of a bad situation? And we keep trying to recreate those habitats for them because we think that's what they want or need. But maybe what they really need are those landscapes that Bob described to us that are 40% open, not 75% closed. Maybe we need to really reconfigure these landscapes and have them be very, very different from today's landscape with a lot less trees, which we are so visually attached to. And there's such the big part of our normal, maybe thinking outside of this box is to let go of some of what we think is what is needed, and how do we get from here to there, and how do we get to a new configuration of the landscape without losing everything that we do have now, because there's a lot of risk, right? So there's our big challenge, and I don't know the answer to that. I think there's going to be some trial and error, and we're going to make mistakes, but again, if we're not measuring, and if we're not monitoring, if we're not keeping track of our successes and our failures for more than just instantaneous points in time, but over the longer term, we will not know if we got it right. And so we need, it's not going to be there's no panacea here. This has got to be true adaptive management, where we try things, where we make mistakes, where we improve on them, where it worked well, we think about what worked, we see if we can expand it, will it work at the next scale? If it worked here, will it also work in the Northeast or out on the coast? Not always. Is there some version of it that would work there? But it's going to mean for all of us to think really carefully about, what are the things that we are allowing ourselves to think outside the box and let go of some of the things that we, if we don't have really, really hard evidence to support that it needs to stay, can we allow it to change a little bit? I think where some of it's being changed, whether we want it to change or not.
I think the wildlifers are sold. They're okay with fire, and they're keen, and they know that, most of these species like mule deer and sheep and elk and moose evolved with fire, and fire is part of the regime. It's just a matter of convincing people who can tell us that we can go light fires. That's our challenge. Okay, we've been talking for a long time, so I'm gonna put one more question, because there's a number of kind of salient issues here, and this ties into what's been going on in the Lower Mainland. And so people want to know how wildfire or large clear cuts, how that plays a role in terms of landslides, erosion, and floods, of course, right? So that's one half of the question, and how do we, post fire deal with that? And then the other half of the question is going to be, are you two aware of any research that's looked at how those two things, large disturbances from cut blocks and wildfire, affects lakes and fish in terms of the aquatic environment and the bugs that are coming up and feeding fish? So go ahead.
Bob, I'm going to jump in, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of add in. There's kind of three parts to my answer, and I'll try to be kind of quick on each of them. We do know that when we have high severity fires, so when fires are burning and generating a lot of heat and consuming the forest floor and the organics that sit on the surface of the mineral soil, we create hydrophobic soils, where we create a layer that is water resistant. It's like a layer of wax paper that essentially forms just below the surface of the ash at the top of the mineral soil, that's impenetrable to water. And so when we get events like we've seen this fall, with high intensity amounts of rain over a short period of time onto those hydrophobic soils, we see that, I think, as a contributing factor to some of the surface flow, runoff, mudslides, debris flows, and then landslides that we're seeing. And we've seen that multiple times since 2017 in our mountainous terrain. We see it across many, many years, but certainly we've seen multiple examples after the 2017, 2018, and now 2021 fires. Clear-cut harvesting also has an impact. We see Dr. Yunus Alila has done some really great research on this out of our department or in the Forest Resources Management Department in the Faculty of Forestry. He has very emphatically and empirically demonstrated that clear-cut logging has an impact on the hydrology of those systems and contributes to the runoff and the flooding that we're seeing. It doesn't create hydrophobic soils. There's not the heating impact, but there certainly is a change in the way that we have water being stored into those systems, being absorbed into the ground or becoming surface runoff. So clear cuts and fire are both contributing to surface runoff. And when we combine them with these extreme weather events like the atmospheric rivers we've experienced, we should expect both more atmospheric rivers into the future and more flooding if we don't change our behavior on the landscape. There are some great examples. Sorry, go ahead, Bob.
Add roads to that.
Yes, and the road networks, of course, are also points of failures, and that's been quite well documented. It's why they're strongly regulated, but we still see them being points of failure, of course. There is some fantastic research. There's been some really good research after fires in 2003 on the east slope of the Rocky Mountains out of the University of Alberta, looking at water quality, water runoff. They used paired, controlled, burned and unburned watersheds in the foothills of Alberta, in the Old Man River watersheds, in the upper watersheds of the Old Man River, and have done some fantastic work there. Followed up with fires. The Kenow fire in Waterton Lakes has been added to that network, where they've had extreme fire there and are looking at the impacts. So that might be a great place to go to look at some really high quality empirical research that I'd love to see replicated here in British Columbia. I've talked with colleagues at UBC Okanagan and at Simon Fraser University, as well as UBC, and these are the kinds of things that we need to be investing in here in BC. In a long-term paleo-ecological records, there is some nice research that comes out of Western University and Carleton University, and a couple of others, colleagues of mine in Ontario, who have been looking at paleo-ecological records, looking at lake sediments and high elevation lakes, where they look at the sediments for charcoal, for pollen, to look at species changes associated with fire, but also at chironomids and other organisms that live in the water and give us indications about water chemistry and changes in pH and other aspects of water chemistry that go along with climate, vegetation, and fire, that give us good insights over that longer term period. And so there's some insights there as to understanding how climate change might be impacting those really, really complex interactions. But again, we need to be measuring, monitoring, and paying attention to what's happening as our landscapes change around us.
Bob?
I don't know what to add to that. Was there a question there about fish?
Yeah, there was one, essentially, how does it affect aquatic biota? And then, of course, naturally, how does it affect fish in terms of these big disturbances around water quality? Yeah, that was the other pair.
Right. So some of the most significant impacts are within the riparian system itself, where you've lost the canopy. You start to have impacts on increasing water temperature, the influx of invertebrates and other food sources. You can have nutrient flushes into riparian systems, which eutrophy systems, and they start to produce more algae, reductions in dissolved oxygen, things like that. You can certainly flush a lot of sediment into systems, although that, depending on the system, it tends to work its way through fairly quickly before you end up having big fish kills, but you can still certainly have big fish kills involved. There's been some studies that have shown, enough of a nutrient import into the system that it does cause fish kills, but it's quite rare. Most of the fish kills are actually associated with retardant use, which is the older retardant mixes contained cyanide, which was used to prevent oxidation in the belly tanks of the retardant ships. I'm not quite sure if Monsanto and Chemonics still do that, but that was a problem But certainly the ammonium diphosphate, which is in retardant, is a fertilizer. So you definitely do not want that into riparian systems because it leads to eutrophication. So those are the big factors: loss of canopy cover, reductions in dissolved oxygen, raised water temperatures, lack of throughput of nutrients and food sources for fish and other aquatics. Those are the big things. We do have a significant, we don't want to see these type of really significant fire effects in riparian systems, but I do have to say that our kid glove approach to riparian systems is really hurting us. It's going to hurt us. We do not do direct management in riparian systems, and because of that, we've left them in a very perilous condition. We've seen a lot of these systems shift completely from multi-storied, shrub-dominated, deciduous-dominated systems to very closed canopy, conifer-dominated systems. They do certainly tick all the boxes for, reduced water temperatures, dissolved oxygen, things like that, but they are a ticking time bomb. And a number of studies have been done in the Western US where these riparian systems are just wicks for fire on the landscape. They tend to carry most of the fuels. And what's worse is what we do after fires. We salvage everywhere, but we leave this ribbon of unsalvaged dead fuels all through the riparian system. So the next fire, where is it going to burn the hottest? It's going to burn the hottest in the riparian system. So a really good friend of mine, Steve Arno, who was a researcher for years and one of our fire history gurus, in Missoula, in the latter part of his career, he was actually documenting a lot of this and looking at these reburn sites in the Boise National Forest in Idaho. About 60% of the forest has burned in the last 15 years. And, they recorded some of the worst fire effects were in riparian zones because they were not restored prior to fire, and they were not restored after fire. And so they just contain massive fuel loads, and they're completely scoured. It's really hard to rehabilitate that. So,
Bob, my research team did some work in kind of 2007, 8, 9 in Alberta, in the Alberta foothills on some of this, looking at coarse woody debris in stream and in riparian zones. And we certainly found that, in fact, leaving some of the snags, a subset of those snags became really important for recruitment of coarse wood into the streams, of course, to mitigate, to create that stream structure, to give habitat structure, especially in smaller streams up the stream network where you don't get a lot of movement of the wood. But you're right, you could also get these big fuel loads. And what we were finding is where there had been buffer zones left along riparian zones that were not wide enough, and where you got a lot of blowdown, you ended up with a large amount of pulses of wood, kind of bridged the streams and then eventually coming into the streams, but creating these big fuel loads that contribute to those wicks in the landscape. So again, that kind of understanding the space-time dynamics of those systems, and then being able to think about those trade-offs and to accept the dynamics of those systems and to think at the right scales is very challenging. It's very challenging for us to do. And really what it comes down to was removal of fire from that system, replacing it with clear-cut logging, thinking that was the emulating fire and part of our how we were going to manage the forest. We went to too simple a model. And clearly, again, more unintended consequences. So we have more nuanced understanding. We have to put that into our management frameworks in more sophisticated ways.
Yeah, and we need really good models to help us guide doing that. Right now, if we wanted to do restoration and hazard mitigation in riparian zones, we don't have a decent stand level model that helps guide us to do that, so that we're not triggering some of these critical threshold levels of dissolved oxygen or water temperature, things like that. So we know we need to do things, but at what scale can we do it where we're not sort of unintended consequences once again and creating more problems? But we can't sit back and do nothing. We have to do something. So we're in a pickle.
The world we live in.
It's the world we live in.
Okay, well, it's just about 9 o'clock, and I feel like people are hanging on, and there are still a number of questions, but I feel like 2 hours is a lot for people to sit in on, and I'm really thrilled that everybody has been so attentive and so engaged. You have a bunch of advocates now, I think, Bob and Dr. Daniels. People got a lot out of this. So, first of all, thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it. For everyone who's tuned in, again, if you feel so inclined, once this is up on the BCWF YouTube channel, feel free to forward this to your MLA. I had somebody ask me if we'll be sending it to the senior staff at Flinrow, and yes, I will make sure that it gets sent to them. I think there's a few of them that are on tonight as well that are listening, so thank you all for taking time outside of your workday to attend this webinar. This has been awesome. Sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. I tried to pick the ones that were as high level as possible. One of the ones that coming up as a theme is how do we move the province to get on with fires? A big part of it, quite frankly, is going to be to pressure your elected officials. I mean, that's where the dollar starts and stops. So once they get the message that we want to see prescribed fire and managed fire as opposed to getting smoked out all summer where our kids aren't allowed outside and we have no wildlife, that's where we need to go. So thank you very much. It's 9 o'clock. It's been a long night. Just want to give a quick shout out. January 18th, we're going to have Dr. Marco Festa Bianche talking about when does selective hunting lead to evolutionary change and what, if anything, should we do about it. This ties into sheep hunting in the province. That's going to be another phenomenal webinar. So that is January 18th at 6 o'clock. Thanks again. This is a full 2 hours. Typically, we don't go this long, but people are still attending. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Take care. Merry Christmas.
Thanks to Brian too. Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.